party in Denmark. But the problem is that when we start to talk about and focus too much attention on national democratic elections, for instance, we completely miss that. And then we start competing with the racist parties on how to talk about it and how to talk to the kind of like the national working class. And that's, of course, that's a huge problem. And it leads into this reverse victimization where Trump can kind of like talk about some kind of American carnage and how come Bush and Clinton have let American workplaces disappear to Southeast Asia and stuff like that. So we have to be careful, kind of like which concepts we use, and we have to be really precise when we engage in these kinds of political analysis, and we that's something we can get by looking at the avant-garde. Actually, I think we have to I don't know what picture I wanted to show. We have to be suspicious of kind of like the inherited political forms and norms. And for instance, the political parties. I'm not sure political parties, at least in Western Europe and the US, I mean, I think they are more an obstacle than anything else, actually. And I think that the kind of like what we have seen, what we saw happen with Syriza in Greece, for instance, doesn't give us much comfort when it comes to the ability of the so-called European left wing to use political parties in any kind of progressive political way. I think it's more a question of the left wing then kind of like doing the work of this crisis-ridden the crisis-ridden neo-liberal elite somehow. So.
Yes, perhaps, as you just mentioned, the example of Syriza, it was indeed like a lesson. Like, look, if you pretend to challenge the system, this is what's going to happen.
Yeah.
And people somehow interiorize it. And the option of populist left parties becomes less popular because the people see that one single country cannot challenge the system, which is global. The markets that can punish you as a country and destroy you, like happened economically with Venezuela, for instance. Or was economically, or Cuba. Cuba is completely blocked. There is no way they can succeed, and it's not a problem of the political system only. So like a global context. So yeah, perhaps that's one of the reasons why right-wing populist parties are getting more support, and also because somehow they represent also the establishment decide to stop the more radical option exemplified by the left wing, as you say.
Oh, I think that's. I mean, that would be my reading of some of these. I mean, this right populist surge, and I would substitute or get rid of the notion of populism, because I would actually get rid of at least in the European context, the distinction between right and left. I think it actually I think we the left are emotionally attached to it, and I think that it actually ends up scrambling the codes, because if someone shows up and says, I mean, I'm right wing and I'm right wing populist, I'll immediately, of course, I mean, position myself or situate myself to the left of that guy, but it doesn't really mean anything anymore, I think. And the problem is, of course, that it for the last 50 years at least, it has tended to fuse with this national democratic system, and that system, of course, has a very precise function. It interpolates people into becoming citizens / consumers, and these identities and that kind of interpolation in an Althusserian sense that's part of what I think these protest movements are trying to get at, actually. And when it comes to Trump, Vox, Salvini, the Danish People's Party, I'm trying to argue that we should discuss and analyze these phenomena as expressions of what I call late capitalist fascism. So I would actually reintroduce the notion of fascism, and of course, fully well knowing that term is extremely complicated to be put into use, and there's a lot of work that has to be done there. But I think it is actually a more precise description of what's going on. If we critically analyze Trump's rhetoric, there's no question that he advances a kind of polygenetic ultranationalism. He's trying to go to trade wars. He's scared. He's creating all these kind of imaginary enemies, protectionism, a kind of capitalist commando economy. So it's actually, more or less all of the ingredients in what we call fascism is actually there. Of course, then there's a difference between two things. Of course, the problem is that when we talk about fascism in retrospect, we see kind of like the conclusion of what German fascism ended up being. But if we are able to look at fascism as a more encompassing phenomenon that also includes Italian fascism, Romanian fascism, etc., I think we get the picture.
Indeed, Professor Brossard made last semester a very interesting speech about the abuse of the word populism, and that we should talk about fascism. Yes, and it was very interesting because perhaps populism as a discursive practice is not what defines best these so-called right-wing authoritarian parties, but maybe could be described as racist totalitarian parties.
Yeah.
Because if we use fascism, we are also implying some militaristic component that not necessarily exists. In the case of Vox, exists, because they are hiring generals to be in the party and they defend Franco's dictatorship.
No, it's true. But it also, when the Italian government managed to arrest, what's his name, Battisti, or when they managed to get him extracted from Brazil, several Italian ministers showed up wearing uniforms when the plane landed. So there is actually, like, as you're saying, there's also some kind of a movement towards some kind of militarization. That's of course also in Trump's idea of the wall and kind of like. But there's differences, but differences that primarily then have to do with kind of like what I would try to talk about as late capitalism. And like, of course, Trump is this strange idiot, but also this idiot that somehow emerges from within this, American late capitalist entertainment culture. And this entertainment culture is extremely important to analyze what the characteristics of that entertainment industry, to talk with Adorno, and how it enables someone as Trump to end up as president. It's really strange.
I also believe, I don't want to monopolize the discussion here, we can switch this once, that this idea that has emerged in the last year about the division of our societies, that so much pluralism that the class struggle, for example, cannot exist because there is not such a thing like a working class. So with all this division, people have felt lost, have felt no power to get united, form an hegemonic project that could challenge the status quo. And all these people like Trump, like Salvini, they offer this nationalist, sometimes ethnic, sometimes just purely based on the nation state image of a subjectivity that can unite finally people, so people see it like a salvation, like, oh, finally someone represents us. He's different. He's not like one of these traditional politicians and so on.
No, that's also why it can be useful to adopt a kind of fairly old-school Marxist analysis, because within the frameworks of something like value theory, we can analyze fascism phenomenon like Trump and Salvini as a kind of scrambled or stupid anti-capitalist analysis. And so first, what they are registering, what they are actually addressing, is the kind of like the falling apart of the American dream. But instead of course coming up with a kind of a whole analysis, instead of analyzing the global social process, which is an Adorno term, they're actually trying to say, okay, so it's the fault of the, I don't know, the people from Mexico or the Chinese or whatever. So they are concretizing kind of like what is actually abstract processes that has to do with the accumulation of capital. And that's what fascism is doing. It's always trying to make these extremely abstract structural processes concrete, saying, okay, so you're to blame, and if we get rid of you, the national community will be saved somehow.
Yeah. I would just like to add something. I mean, I think aside from the fact that we talk about tyrants here, we talk about maybe Trump, or in Hungary you have Viktor Orban. In the Philippines we have Rodrigo Duterte, who is almost copying the techniques of Donald Trump. But I think we also have to take note on how they capitalize on the idea of nostalgia. I mean, other than the fact that they reproduce this kind of knowledge, that this idea of they will make America great again, or we will go back to the golden ages, I think it's also important to take note that there's this certain idea or memory of a particular past that they bank on, which they try to romanticize in a sense. But in this sense of romanticization, it creates an illusion. I mean, it tries to achieve something that's never happened. You're an art historian. Back then I also practiced history, and we all know that everything that happened in the past has its own context. And if you take the more modernist approach, then you know that in time everything progresses, and analysis of each epoch should be based on the context, the time frame, and the space, blah, blah, blah. And the point is that if you promise to return to that particular era, you're not necessarily promising something that will happen, but you're promising an illusion to the people. So I think that's one more thing that we need to take note. On a second note, I also wanted to mention this issue on categories, because for example, in the Philippines, it's always hard to determine who's left and right. Because at the end of the day, we go back to Rancière. I mean, we've been talking about Rancière in class, about policing and the differentiation between policing and politics. That at the end of the day, what the state usually does is to maintain, or maintain what they prescribe in order to keep the miscount that they intended to keep. So what I'm trying to say here is that even, for example, Duterte's government in the Philippines banks on the 16 million voters who, in the same case in the United States, you have this big, massive votes for Trump. But of course, others will argue that Trump won because of the Electoral College, blah, blah, blah. But my main point is that this sense of populism is not necessarily the popular. For example, and which brings me to this idea that branding a populist movement as populist is very problematic. And branding something left and something right is also problematic. But because, for example, when you say a person is left, it's very much used in Southeast Asia. When you're branded as a leftist, then you're associated with communism. It comes with so many baggages, which makes a different perspective of what the left is. But other than that, I think it's also important to note that every movement will have its peculiarity. You know, like for example, when you talk about this working class, every societies will have different working class. The reason why I'm emphasizing is because even if you talk about neoliberalization here, neoliberalism in the Western Europe or in the US, if we talk about our origins, Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam, etc., working class will have different definitions. And in many cases, the working class is almost like maybe less than 20% of the total population. And in democracies that have this kind of mechanism that allows the people to actually vote for the president, for example, in the case of the Philippines, it's not necessarily the working class voting for that particular Duterte. I mean, and in that sense, it's maybe we can agree that the working class is no longer an issue here. And on my last note, I wanted to emphasize on this issue of, I'm sorry, I'm really bringing out several ideas here, but I think we can come back to your notion of, anyway, what's my on the third note, I really wanted to also pick up on this idea of totalitarianism. I mean, democracies, as we also discussed in class, democracies are always masked with this idea of being a totalitarian. Like, for example, you always have this idea of the military. When leftist people do the marching in the streets, they always say, Duterte fascista, you know, fascist president, you know. And this idea that people who actually protest against the government has an understanding of what's happening. But the thing is, the government will not listen to them because of the very reason that Rancia tells us about this, or maybe Agamben tells us about this, that it doesn't really matter what they talk about so long as they, you know, so long as the government can maintain what they really wanted to maintain and keep the money among themselves, or keep the business going among the Chinese and the Southeast Asians in terms of the oligarchies. So yeah, so these 3 points that I just really wanted to raise: the issue of nostalgia, the issue of totalitarianism, and the issue of popular vote.
Maybe wait a little bit. Let's hear different students' comments. Maybe you can put these together. Other feedback or comments? Please. No? Please? Women? Don't think you cannot intervene. You have a lot of your own cultural background that you can intervene. Maybe let me add something that maybe we can follow up. So when we talk about this categorization or categorical fetishism again, that is it is still very important to reconsider or redefine what does it mean by avant-garde, or avant-garde in different historical, political, social, and cultural context, not only in Eastern Europe, but also Southeast Asia, okay, or Northeast Asia, or Africa, and so on. So when we talk about avant-garde, of course, it's a military term, right? Not only in the football, but or in art, but it's a leading, fighting unit in front of the army. So whoever marches in the front and trying to break the barricade or the frontier line, battle line, and so on. So when we talk about avant-garde, of course, I think Peter Berger and other people are fixated in this moment in Western Europe and also in the 30s and 20s. But we also know that this maybe according to Rancière, but other people too. This in his book, The Bagage of the Sensitive, the regional, the aesthetics or the sharing of the sensibility. So when we talk about aestheticization of politics or politicization of aesthetics, it's a false concept because they are in the bagage of the time, the moment. So the avant-garde, the futurist, the fascist, or the constructionist and or surrealist, they share the same impulse to break through. We can also say that in Mussolini and Pasolini, there's something relevant, or they share the same. But of course, the difference is whether they act out or whether they take a different form to show what they want to break through. So when we act out, we use violence. When we present through the form, then we show the institution or the regime we want to criticize. We do it in an artistic way. But in whatever action, revolution, political or artistic, there's always a split in the moment or bifurcation. Like whenever they break through, whenever they take the power and they are reused or consumed and commodified, then it became a cliche. Right. But that is, I'm coming back to this question of avant-garde, or according to you, it's a materialistic analysis of this avant-garde art. Okay, whether it's a surrealism, futurism, Dada, or constructionism in this, after the First World War and in between this two World War, when the leftists, they criticize this capitalism and also the bourgeois and so on. But they share similar temporal or historical moment of this art they call the invention of or discovery of electricity and so on. So and other things. But when we talk about the avant-garde in Southeast Asia, for example, Indonesia, in Malaysia, Philippines, or even India, where they have been through this colonial modernism, right? Influenced by, for example, thought, but they reappropriated through the French avant-garde modernism, or Spanish or Dutch, and they appropriated whatever language or motif. Even in Taiwan too, there was surrealism in Taiwan, and also in South Korea, okay, and other countries. So they use the language, the motif, and to confront and to challenge this institution or their political environment. So that is, but what are the avant-garde? As you say, avant-garde is still among us. So what are they? What forms or technologies or what they are using, and against what regime, what institution, what conceptual ideology, and so on, what law or what juridical ideology, what they are trying to break through or to challenge. So I think this is the very crucial question for us to think. Just follow up what we discussed. If we want to consider civic disobedience, do we just destroy the parliament, or do we use or appropriate whatever language we could to voice our disagreement or our challenge against the law, against the institution, against whatever arbitrary law that's confining citizens, right? Whether they have citizenship or not, but they are citizens. So those are the things we need to still consider, and not to be limited to certain categorical confined, be limited in a certain historical moment. Just my point. But I do want people to act. Okay, so that is, what actions can we take? But when we say decolonization, it starts, of course, from epistemic decolonization, right? It is no longer overthrowing of the regime, even internal regime, because it doesn't work, right? The change of regime, I don't know, still there will be this all different kinds of institutionalization of the confinement and canalization of the power concentration. So how do we really challenge in terms of in the form of either art or literature or other things, right? just my comment. I just wanted to
Yeah.
pick up a little bit. Then you can comment too.
I think what I'm trying to do, I mean, it's that's in a way. I mean, the first part of the presentation was in a way an attempt to finally get rid of the notion of the avant-garde, and that's also, for instance, the first text in the book that after the Great Refusal. The Great Refusal is a term Marcuse uses in the 60s, precisely as a term that where he's able to go back and forth between politics and art or aesthetics, and it can in different occasions refer to either aesthetics or to politics or and he actually, it's interesting because he of course he picks up the notion from Blanchot. It's Blanchot's a short text Blanchot writes against de Gaulle when de Gaulle takes power in a kind of state coup in 58. He writes a text called Il faut refuser. It's necessary to refuse, and it's like an unconditional refusal. So there's nothing to discuss actually. So it might actually be, I don't know if I think it's like a secret ingredient for Foucault's notion of later, and like what this notion of the is it unconditional. Yeah, exactly, intolerable. When Blanchot talks about this refusal, but the first longer text in After the Great Refusal is a radical critique of the notion of avant-garde, precisely having to do with these militaristic connotations that are, of course, all over the place in the notion of the avant-garde, kind of like this. And we find it from surrealism to the Situationist International, this notion of this small enlightened group of primarily men who know the right analysis of what is to be done, how to undertake the necessary militaristic actions, etc. So I think it's very important to continue that critique of the notion of avant-garde, and that's in a way what I also try to do in the first part of the lecture, connecting it to like this, like the discursive inertia of talking about the avant-garde yet again. And I think that, I mean, in some ways I would, but I'm not sure. But I would say that one of the questions we have to come to terms with is, of course, or raise, is whether the form of the avant-garde mirrors the form of the party. So perhaps the notion of avant-garde in that particular political or post-political or anti-political or anti-aesthetic form, at least in the West, belongs to a previous historical period. I mean, like I'm arguing that the political party within national democracy is probably no longer relevant. That might also be the case with the avant-garde. I mean, that's what I'm trying to get at. But this also means that in the second part of the presentation that if we somehow try to come up with an adequate description of the present conjuncture, it's rather striking that that we somehow seem to be entering a period that is beginning to look a little bit like the beginning